Now, I've met some real characters in my time, but there's a certain kind of story you just can't shake off. The kind that makes you stop and think, how did it come to this? That's what we're looking at today, homelessness in the UK. It's a growing problem and it's easy to turn a blind eye, but there are faces, names and lives behind these statistics. Over the next few minutes, we're going to dive deep into 10 stories, 10 lives touched by homelessness. From veterans struggling with PTSD to families forced onto the streets, these are extreme cases, the sharp edge of a very real crisis. The people we'll meet, they're not that different from you or me. They had jobs, families, homes. But life, as they say, has a way of throwing curveballs. It's time we stopped looking away and started seeing the human cost of this crisis. John's story, it's sadly not uncommon. He was made redundant from his job in construction about 5 years ago. Shortly after, his health took a turn. Couldn't keep up with the rent, ended up on the streets. He told me he never imagined this is where he'd be. He sleeps rough mostly, tries to find a dry spot when it rains. He's got this little tent, but it's seen better days. Holes in it, you know. He showed me his sleeping bag, threadbare, damp, doesn't do much for warmth. John survives on whatever he can find, scraps from bins mostly. Sometimes people give him change. He says the worst part, apart from the cold and the hunger, is the loneliness. The feeling that people just don't see him. He's tried to get back on his feet, of course, but it's a vicious cycle. Without an address, it's near impossible to get a job. Without a job, he can't afford a place to live. John's story, it's a reminder that homelessness can happen to anyone. All it takes is a bit of bad luck, a few things going wrong. Now, Jane's story, that's a different kind of heartbreak. She fled an abusive relationship with her 2 young children, had to leave everything behind, start from scratch. She ended up in a hostel, 1 room for the 3 of them. Cramped, you know, and not exactly a place for kids to thrive. But it was shelter at least. Finding work was a struggle. She had to juggle childcare, couldn't take just any job. The hours never seemed to add up. She told me about the constant fear, the worry about where their next meal would come from, whether they'd have a roof over their heads. The guilt, she said, that's the worst part. The feeling that she's failed her children. Jane's story highlights the plight of many women facing homelessness. Domestic violence is a major factor, forcing them to choose between staying in a dangerous situation or risking the streets. Mark's a veteran, served in Afghanistan, came back a changed man, PTSD they call it. Nightmares, flashbacks, the works. He struggled to hold down a job, couldn't cope with the noise, the crowds, pushed everyone away, ended up isolating himself. He told me about the guilt, the shame he carries. Feels like he let his mates down, couldn't hack it back home. He's been on the streets for a while now. Says it's hard to trust anyone, feels safer on his own. He sleeps rough, avoids shelters. Too many triggers, he says. Mark's story, it's a stark reminder of the hidden cost of war, the invisible wounds that can linger long after the battles are over. Chapter 4. Emily Brown, lost in the system. Emily's story, it's a gut punch. She aged out of the foster care system when she turned 18. No family, no support network, just a small bag of possessions and nowhere to go. She bounced around hostels for a bit, but it's no place for a young woman on her own. Dangerous, she said. She ended up on the streets trying to survive. She told me about the constant fear, the feeling of being invisible, forgotten. Said she feels like she doesn't belong anywhere. She tries to find work, but it's hard without a permanent address. And without a job, she can't afford a place to live. It's a vicious cycle. Emily's story exposes the cracks in our safety net. What happens to those who fall through? Who looks after them when they have no one else? Chapter 5. Robert Wilson, a decade of drifting. Robert's been homeless for over a decade. He suffers from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. Makes it hard to breathe, hard to get around. He used to be a mechanic, loved tinkering with engines, he said. But the illness took that away from him. He sleeps in a doorway now, huddled under a pile of blankets. He showed me his inhaler, almost empty. Said he's been meaning to get a refill, but it's hard to keep track of things when you're living day to day. He told me he doesn't expect much from life anymore, just a warm place to sleep, a bit of food in his belly. Robert's story underscores the harsh reality of long-term homelessness. It's a life of constant struggle, of dwindling hope. Chapter 6. Sarah Davis. When home goes up in smoke. Sarah's life changed in an instant. A fire ripped through her flat building, destroying everything she owned. She managed to escape with her life, but that's all she had left. She spent a few nights in a hotel, emergency accommodation they called it, but it was only temporary. She tried to find a new place, but the rents were sky high. She couldn't afford it, not on her wages. She told me about the despair, the feeling of being utterly lost. Said she never thought something like this could happen to her. Sarah's story is a reminder that homelessness can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. Michael's been on the streets for 3 years. He struggles with addiction, says it's what landed him here in the first place. He sleeps rough mostly, spends his days trying to get by, trying to score his next fix. He told me about the constant battle in his head, the desire to get clean, the fear of what sobriety might bring, but recently something changed. He met an outreach worker from a local charity, started going to their drop-in centre, getting a hot meal, a bit of support. He's even started attending their recovery program. Says it's hard, but he's determined to turn his life around. Michael's story offers a glimmer of hope. It demonstrates the power of human connection, the impact that even a small act of kindness can have. Chapter 8. Lisa White, Evicted and Alone. Lisa lost her job as a cleaner during the pandemic. She couldn't keep up with the rent and ended up getting evicted. She lived in a shared house before that, but with no family to fall back on, she found herself out on the streets. She told me about the shame, the humiliation of having to sleep rough. Said she feels invisible, like people just look right through her. She tries to find work, but it's difficult. She doesn't have a permanent address and her phone's dead. Lisa's story highlights the systemic issues that contribute to homelessness, the lack of affordable housing, the precarious nature of low-wage work. Chapter 9. David Green. Community Rallies. David's a familiar face in his community. He's been homeless for a while and suffers from mental health issues. He sleeps rough, usually on the same park bench. He told me he likes it there, feels safe. The local community, they look out for him. They bring him food, blankets, warm clothes. They even helped him get a new sleeping bag when his old one fell apart. He's well known at the local soup kitchen too. They always save him a plate, make sure he gets a hot meal. David's story is a testament to the power of community, of what can happen when people come together to support those in need. Chapter 10. Anna Black. The search for a home. Anna's been homeless for 2 years. She fled an abusive relationship and ended up on the streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. She's been in and out of hostels, but it's not a permanent solution. She's desperate for a place of her own, a place to feel safe and secure. She told me about the constant fear, the uncertainty of not knowing where she'll sleep each night. She's on a waiting list for social housing, but it's long and there's no guarantee she'll be offered anything suitable. Anna's story represents the thousands of people trapped in the cycle of homelessness, desperate for a way out. We've met 10 people, 10 stories, each a stark reminder of the human cost of homelessness. From veterans battling invisible wounds to families torn apart by circumstance, these stories challenge us to look closer, to see beyond the stereotypes. These are not just statistics, they're mothers, fathers, sons and daughters. They're people who, through a combination of bad luck, systemic failures and life's cruel twists of fate, have found themselves without a place to call home. But there is hope. And organizations like mentioned specific charities are working tirelessly to provide support, from food and shelter to addiction recovery and job training. Even small acts of kindness can make a difference. A donation, a warm meal, a listening ear, every little bit helps. Let's work together to make a difference. Like this video, share it with your friends and subscribe for more content. Thank you for watching.